So the Fed has these three monetary policy instruments. We've already covered them enough times, but we've never really spoken about how it really changes the money supply. Well, in these next couple of videos, we're going to dive into that of how it actually changes the money supply and what kind of effects can we see by changing one of these different monetary policies. So we've already talked about it, and the three monetary policies, of course, are changing the required reserve ratio, changing that discount rate or the federal funds rate, and then the buying and selling of these government bonds. So I put up this nice little table for you that will kind of more or less is a little cheat sheet where you can reference it to figure out how everything is working. And what you'll notice over here is that we have the three different monetary policies. And then on this side we talk about, is it going to increase or decrease loans? That's going to be the key in this. The monetary policy instruments are designed to either increase or decrease the amount of loans that the banks are giving out. By increasing or decreasing the amount of loans, we are going to manipulate or affect the money supply because of that. And in the next video or some of the next videos is where we're going to talk about how it actually increases or decreases those loans. So bear with me for right now, and we're going to kind of go through this cheat sheet. If we look at the required reserve ratio, if we lower the required reserve ratio, so let's say, for example, the required reserve ratio was 20% and we decrease it to 10%. By decreasing that required reserve ratio, that opens up for more excess reserves. It opens up and frees up a lot of those reserves. Rather than keeping $200, they only have to keep $100 now. So that's an extra $100 in loans, and they increase those loans. The opposite happens if they raise the required reserves. By raising the required reserves, it reduces the amount of excess reserves. The lower the excess reserves, it actually is going to decrease the amount of loans that can be given out. If we change the discount rate of the federal funds rate, what if we lower these interest rates? Well, if we lower these interest rates, it actually causes an increase in loans. So if we lower the discount rate, and now banks are realizing that they can borrow at a low interest rate and then sell it or loan it out to somebody else at a higher interest rate, it's going to increase the loans. Also, if that federal funds rate is lower, it entices banks to loan out or become more riskier with loaning out too much money and actually not having enough required reserves. Because if they realize if the federal funds rate is low, they don't have enough required reserves, guess what? They're just going to go borrow from another bank at a low interest rate. But the opposite will happen if they raise those interest rates, raise the discount rate, raise the federal funds rate. If they raise those interest rates, now the banks are having to pay more for the money that they are trying to loan out. They're going to have to be paying a higher interest rate, a higher cost to obtain that money to loan it out to somebody else. The higher that cost is, the less likely they are to borrow that money. Just like an individual, you as an individual, the higher the interest rate you have to pay, the less likely you are going to take that loan. Banks are the same way. The higher the interest rate, the less likely the banks are going to borrow that money to loan it out to somebody else because they're not making a profit or not making enough of a profit. So if we talk about buying and selling of government bonds, dealing with that open markets committee, if we are buying bonds, if the federal government is buying U.S. bonds, then what they are doing is they are buying it, putting money back into the hands of the people who are selling it. The people who are selling it are basically the citizens of the United States. Are basically the federal government, the Fed, is putting money back into the hands of the citizens. The citizens put them in banks, and those banks now have more deposits. They can increase their loans. The opposite would happen if the federal government was selling bonds. Federal government decides they're going to sell bonds, then they are actually selling it to the citizens. The citizens are paying or pulling money out of the banks to give to the Fed in exchange for those bonds. Because they are pulling money out of the banks, there's less reserves, there's less deposits, and those banks are forced to actually decrease the amount of loans that they have. So how does changing the bank's ability to make loans actually affect the money supply? So what we found out is that there is a relationship between the level of reserves in the bank and the money supply. So let's focus on the M1 money supply first. Let's give you a little bit of background before we dive into actually how it works. So coins and currency are physical units. If we opened up your wallet right now and you actually had cash on you, or you went and found the coin jar in your house, that is actual physical units of cash. That's part of that M1 money supply. But what is another major aspect of the M1 money supply? Do you remember? I remember this, I was going back to, I believe, chapter 12. Well, another major aspect of that money supply, of the M1 money supply, are these checkable deposits. And a checkable deposit, your checking account, that's just an entry in an account. That's just a piece of paper saying that, yes, you do have this much money in a bank. And nowadays, it's all digital. So it's just a digital amount. It's just a digital deposit, a digital entry into an account. Doesn't mean that there's actually that much money stashed away somewhere. It's just a digital amount. It's an entry into an account. So if we take that, amount that is entered into that checkable deposit, that is simply just an entry in that account, and we increase that amount, maybe you got paid, and you increase the amount of deposits in that bank can now make out more loans. And as that bank loans out that money to somebody else, and that money is used, it goes to somebody else, it's loaned to somebody else, and they use that to buy things, well, now that's money going into other people's hands, and it goes right back into another bank. So we start using a small entry to start generating more entries down the line, and we'll cover that in one of the next videos. So new deposits are created by making loans with excess reserves. It's kind of what I was alluding to. Even though there may not have been any cash changing hands, because we are transferring entries in these accounts and we're loaning out more money based off of these entries in these accounts, we're taking these new deposits and we're making loans with these excess reserves. But how? Well, stay tuned, because that's what we're going to talk about in one of these next videos.